Hello everyone, Kenton Kivestu here, the founder of RocketBlocks, and welcome back to part 2 in our series on behavioral interviews. In part 1, we talked about how to identify and select the right stories to share in your behavioral interviews. The link for that one is down below. And in today's video, we're going to talk about how to structure your stories so that when you tell them, they really hit with impact and make a positive impression on your interviewer. So what we're going to do is we're going to kick off things and we're going to talk a little bit about why structuring is so important for delivering a story that really hits with impact, and then talk about a particular framework that we've developed at RocketBlocks that can be really helpful for structuring your stories and making sure that you communicate all the value that you've brought in your past roles and career experiences. So let's go ahead and jump in. First, let's talk about the importance of structure in storytelling. I think there's a myth out there that to be a good storyteller, it's all about creativity. And yes, of course, creativity is important to making a story lively and engaging, but it is not the key ingredient that is really going to make a story successful and make it shine and make it have a true impact on its audience. And that key ingredient is structure. And if you think about, some of the most creative individuals or entities out there in the world, this is true of how they approach storytelling as well. So think of someone like Pixar, an incredibly creative leader in the animation space, and at the same time, they are incredibly structured with how they deliver and tell their stories through the art of film. So let's think back to one of their very first movie, actually, Toy Story. It's an incredibly creative and fun, successful movie, but underpinning all of that is an incredibly strong structure that makes that story work. So let's actually put up here a story arc, and let's talk through it quickly and then see how Pixar uses something like that to deliver a really good story in Toy Story. So in any story arc, you have an initial sort of setting of the scene, then you introduce a problem, and there's sort of rising action that originates out of that problem, ultimately a climax, falling action, and then a final resolution. And part of the reason that that climax becomes so sort of like tense and that resolution ultimately feels so good is because the scene has been set, the problem has been introduced, and then it sort of ratchets up from there. So when the climax and the resolution happens, it feels great. And for an audience, it really hits with impact. Now, something like Toy Story, how they do this is they set the scene. There's a young boy, Andy, that has a bunch of toys, and those toys are all friends with each other. There is a problem that gets introduced, which is that there is a birthday party coming up, which means a new toy is going to be introduced to the group. Then a new toy actually arrives, which is Buzz Lightyear. It creates a power struggle between Buzz and Woody, and there's rising action until a climax where Woody and Buzz ultimately duke it out in the neighbor's backyard, and there's like an evil neighbor that's like trying to kill them. They escape, there's falling action as they make their way back to Andy's house, and then ultimately there's a resolution, which is Woody and Buzz become friends. Okay, so this is an incredibly creative movie, but underpinning all of it, there is a very clear story arc and structure that's being followed. And the reason that Toy Story can be so successful is because it's set up that story correctly. That's part of the reason why when you have the climax and the falling action and the resolution, it feels great. So the same thing can be applied when you're telling stories in your responses to behavioral interview questions. And we're going to talk about a framework for doing that in the next section. Okay, so now that we've talked about why structuring is important, let's talk about applying structure to your behavioral interviews. Now, there's a canonical framework that's out there, which is called the STAR framework, and it stands for situation, task, action, and result. And faced with a choice of using, say, STAR versus no structure at all in your behavioral interviews, definitely going with something like STAR is going to be a better call. However, I think there's some things where STAR just doesn't take us quite far enough. First, the second bucket in STAR is task, which makes it sound a little more rote. And often the type of challenges and things we're wrestling with that are going to make the best stories are going to be anecdotes where there's a little more meat into just even figuring out what you had to do and navigating some really particularly thorny problem or challenge. So I think that's the first part where task seems a little overly mechanical for what this type of stories we're actually going to be sharing if we're applying to McKinsey or Google, Facebook, etc. Then the other thing that's a shortcoming of the STAR model is it doesn't afford any room for sharing the lessons that you learned from it and reminding folks that the lessons that you learned from these experiences are really critical, because that's the part that you actually take to your new employer. They don't get the benefit of whatever work you did in the past aside from what you've learned and gained from that experience. So I think incorporating lessons is really important. So the model I'd like to propose is the RocketBlocks model that we call the SCAR-L model. So we're sticking with the Disney theme here, SCAR, like the lion from The Lion King, with L tacked on the end. And what does that stand for? It stands for situation, challenges, actions, results, and lessons. So we end with that lessons component there. And let's talk about each of these different steps. So first, situation. This is where you're going to lay out what is the general situation that you're operating in during the story you're sharing. This might be the role that you have, the particular company you're at, and a little bit of context about the project or initiative you're working on. Oftentimes people will jump directly into talking about the actions that they've taken without giving any of the basic context, and then you lose your interviewer right off the bat because they don't even know what company you're talking about or what the general context was. Then it doesn't sort of matter what you've done because they're just confused. So always start with that situation and context. Then second component is the challenges. And the key thing you want to do here is paint a picture of what was the challenge in front of you. What was the issue that you had to navigate or the particularly thorny problem that you had to figure out? And importantly, and oftentimes people forget this, you want to really hammer home what is the cost of failure. If you don't resolve this particular challenge, is the company going to lose an important new client? Our revenue is going to decline by 10%. Is a project going to go completely awry and upset potentially suppliers and other vendors, etc.? You want to really share the cost of failure so that later when you're talking about what you do, your audience understands that your actions are really important because it helped prevent that failure mode from ever happening. So that's the challenges bucket. Then of course there's the actions bucket. This is where you're going to describe what you actually did. And here, as we referenced in the first video, you want to be sharing stories where you can talk about the specific, detailed actions you took. You want to share the exact sort of tactical steps that you took in this particular challenge you were facing so that someone gets a really good idea of not just what your team accomplished or your company or your project, but specifically what actions you took to drive things forward and resolve whatever particular challenge you're referencing is. Then of course, you want to share the results. So what was achieved through your actions, and where possible, you want to quantify those results and show, here's the, bump up we got in revenue, or the amount of new clients we won, or the cost savings that came from my action. If it's not something that you can quantify, you at least want to be concrete with what happened. We did X and Y, and as a result of that, we retained this client. Or I spent a bunch of time, talking with partners X and partners Y and getting them on the same page, which then made this team and the collaboration work out versus falling apart. So it may not be totally quantifiable, but it is at least concrete. And then the last thing that you want to remember is thinking about sharing those lessons that you learned. And again, this part is incredibly important because if you think about it from the employer's perspective, everything you've shared up until this point is just a nice story about your past. It is something that's happened in the past, and hopefully it illuminates a little bit of your skills, but the lessons that you learned are something that they will benefit from in the future. So if you bettered a particular skill or learned something really insightful that you can now take to the new company, that's incredibly valuable for them. And you can even take that lesson and connect it to how you'd be able to apply it in the job that you're currently interviewing for to really package it all up and bring it home. So that's the framework that I think is great for using in your interviews, regardless of whether it's a behavioral interview for, say, a Facebook product manager role or a consulting role at BCG. The model is SCAR-L, and it stands for situation, challenges, actions, results, and lessons. Okay, so that's a wrap on part 2 of our behavioral interview series on structuring your answers for behavioral interview questions. If you're prepping for behavioral interviews now, I highly encourage you to check out our behavioral interview prep module. There's a link down below. It helps you go through the process of identifying the right stories, structuring them as we were just speaking about, and of course, framing and reframing those stories depending on the different types of behavioral interview questions you face. That's also the topic of our third video in the series coming up next week. So thank you again for watching. If you're not a subscriber yet already, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button below. We've got a ton of great content coming out on a weekly basis, and we hope to see you soon.